안녕하세요 여러분. 다이얼로그 디스위크를 시청해주셔서 감사합니다. 10월 9일 내일 한글날을 맞아 우리말로 인사를 드려봤습니다. Welcome to our first edition of Dialogue This Week. In this corner, we will invite guests from in and out of Korea to talk about a wide variety of issues, ranging from culture, sports, to the latest trends around the world. Like you probably guessed, I greeted you in the Korean language, as our topic for this week is Hangeulnal, or the Korean Alphabet Day. Every October 9th is Hangeul Day in Korea, which commemorates the promulgation of Hangeul, or the Korean alphabet, created by the 15th century Korean monarch Sejong the Great. The day has been designated as a national holiday in South Korea since 1970. And like you know, this year it falls on a Saturday, allowing us to have a 3-day-long weekend from today. For a more in-depth discussion on the background and the rising usage of the Korean language across the globe, we are joined by Dr. Anders Carlson, chair of the Center for Korean Studies at SOAS University of London. And also joining us will be Nue, a Myanmar student studying in Korea University. It's great to have you both in our show. Now, first,
안녕하세요.
안녕하세요. First off, let's start with Dr. Carlson. I heard that you teach Korean language and Korean culture in London. Can you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your job as a Korean lecturer at SOAS?
Yes, so I teach Korean language and about Korea here at SOAS. I've been in the game for a very long time. Myself, I started studying Korean in 1987 back in Sweden, and the first time I visited Korea was in 1989. In the early 1990s, after graduating from university, I lived a couple of years in Seoul, and I've been teaching about Korea at universities for more than 25 years. I've been now at SOAS for more than 20 years, teaching about Korean society, culture, the history. I mean, my own specialty is Korean history, the Joseon period history, in particular the 18th and the 19th century. But also teaching more contemporary areas. So now at SOAS we do have a module called K-Culture, a course, K-Culture. We try to cover all of these various aspects of Korean culture that is so globally popular these days.
Mm-hmm. Wow, 1989. Since you've been studying the language for so long. For starters, can you please tell us a little bit about its background and its usage? What makes the Korean language unique?
Yes, I mean, so the main uniqueness of the Korean language is, of course, that it uses a phonetic script that was devised for the language in the mid-15th century by King Sejong, and that's one of the joys of teaching Korean language, is to be able to tell that very fascinating story about the creation and the invention of the Korean alphabet, Hangeul as it's known today, or Hunmin Jeongeum as it was known when it was created, and the fascinating principles behind the characters, so the consonants. They are representing then the speech organs, the way they look when you make those sounds. The vowels, that would be a horizontal, a vertical line, and a dot, and that's philosophically representing then heaven, man, and earth. So being able to bring all of that kind of more cultural history into teaching the Korean language, I find that's a very interesting and fascinating aspect of it all. And then before that, of course, in Korea, they would have used Chinese characters for representing both the Korean language, the vernacular language, in various systems, one of them known as Idu, or the most prominent written language would have been classical Chinese. So it is a very important development in Korean history, yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I heard that nearly around 30 countries across the world are adopting Korean as their second foreign language. In fact, the number of people learning Korean seems to be increasing day by day. What's your state behind this? Do you think, what do you think are more people learning this language?
It's certainly due to the popularity of Korean culture and Korean popular culture around the world today. And that's another fascinating aspect of this, is that someone who's interested in Korean music, they hear a song they like that song, that really rubs up and it spreads to a larger interest in Korea, in Korean culture, in Korean society, and also in particular in Korean language, and really wants to know more. And of course, today with the technology that we have, it is very easy for yourself to go online and you can learn more. And as you do that, you really get into various aspects of Korea. I think that's really feeding into the increase in the number of students who want to learn Korean. And of course, we see that here in Europe and in the UK.
Well, speaking of someone who gained interest in the Korean language, let's through the Korean culture contents, let's turn to Nue. I heard you're a student from Myanmar who came to South Korea, and you're studying in one of the country's most prestigious universities. Can you introduce yourself to us and tell us why and how did you come to Korea?
I'm Nunulai from Myanmar. Currently, I'm in my first semester of master degree, majoring in international business of the Korean University Graduate School. That was such a long story for me to share with you. And this is the third time I came here. I won the grand prize in the Korean language speaking test in my country and was chosen as the final candidate to compete in Korea as the final competition. That was the first time I came to Korea in 2019 before pandemic. So everything was cool as I expected and without Corona and without Max. From that contest, I got the scholarship for 6 months to have a language training program in Korean University, Korean Language Center. So I came back to Korea next year, 2020, and I lived for 6 months. And during these 6 months, I got to know myself that I want to stay for longer and I want to continue my master degree in Korean University. But my visa was for 6 months long, so I have to go back to Myanmar. And in my country, I searched all scholarship opportunities, and I found that Global Korean Scholarship, and I applied for it. And maybe I'm lucky for some scholarship and abroad study opportunities. I think, as I got into it, and I came back Korea for a third time as the graduate student in Korea University. Here.
Well, you just mentioned that you participated in a Korean contest. But
Yeah.
at the first place, like, why did you decide? When did you get interest in the Korean language?
Or since my middle school days, my friends were deeply in love with Korean culture, like K-pop, and they introduced me some Korean stuff like Super Junior and Korean dramas at the time. Also, Korean dramas were broadcasted in our national TV channel, so I watched Korean drama at the time, and I completely fall in love with that. So, learning Korean language and understanding every Korean words, what they say in the drama, is one of my biggest lead at the time. I think timing is really important that time because I came across an information that in our university, we can learn Korean language for free at Sejong Institute, which is located in our campus. So why not? That was a great opportunity for me. So I grabbed the chance and I started learning Korean language in 2016, I think. So 2 years later, there was a competition, Korean speech contest there. So I gave it a try, and luckily I got into it. And after that, I started as a hobby at first, Korean language, but later I found I really passionate about it, and I want to use my Korean language in the further education purposes. So.
Well, you've mentioned that you're from Myanmar, so I must ask, how popular is the Korean language in Myanmar?
Before pandemic, there is a Korean language proficiency test called TOPIK, that is held in Myanmar every year. I noticed I noticed every year the number of students who took these tests were increasing. Is increasing every year. So that means many students are learning Korean language and they are willing to study in Korea University. Also, me and my two of my friends, they are in here. We are together. Preparing together to come to Korea and apply in university, and I got to know some new friends who were preparing for studying in Korea. I even when I came this time, I got a little chat with two friends beside my seats on the plane. I got to know that they came here for language study purpose with their own money, not like scholarship program or from the foundation from the scholarship like that. They paid their own money to have a language school program here. So I'm really surprised by the fact Korean language is really popular within Myanmar students again.
Yes. Now let's turn to Dr. Carlson. As a non-Korean who both learned and is teaching the Korean language and Hangeul, the written form of language, do you think it's easy to learn? Do you think the language is easy to learn compared to other languages?
Hangul, the alphabet, is certainly easy. It was devised to really match the Korean language, which also then means that there are certain aspects of the Korean language that are easy to learn. But I wouldn't say that the Korean language in itself is easy. It wasn't easy for me. I think for many speakers of European languages, just the very different grammar and the word order, etc., can be a little bit of a struggle. And also the different ways in which the social linguistics is involved in the language as well will make it difficult. But yes, thanks to Hangul, initially it's very easy to start learning the Korean language.
Well, now, with the popularity of K-pop and Korean dramas, there are a lot of contents where we can learn Korean. But before, when you first started learning Korean, I must ask, were there a lot of resources? How was it for you?
No, there was really no presence in media, on radio, in TV, but Korea, you couldn't really get exposed to the Korean language very much. So studying Korean, it was very academic, philological. You were studying the grammar, etc. So that's why after I graduated from university, I decided I want to come to Korea and live in Korea for a couple of years to really get immersed in the language, which was a very interesting experience then. It's not like now a lot of foreign students flocking to Seoul to study there. We were a much smaller cohort of students who were there to study. Yeah, it was very different.
Now, how about Nene? Now that you're capable of speaking and writing the Korean language, what advantages has this brought you?
Of course, there's so many advantages I gain because I can speak and write in Korean. As a Korean speaker, I experienced so many Korean cultural events and activities, including internships and job opportunities in Myanmar. Before I came here for the second time, I tried for the internship program at Shinhan Bank Yangon branch for a month, and I was chosen as the permanent staff, and I worked for months there. In Korean, we call these experiences like specs. I think maybe these lines of specs did a great job when I applied for the university, when I applied for the graduate degree in Korea University. And now due to this step, I can share my experiences with you all.
Well, Nene, like you just said, do you have any tips for foreigners who are learning the Korean language? Do you have anything to say to them?
Of course, I'm still learning Korean, but so for me, I think it's really important when you learn a language. It's really important to memorize some vocabs and grammar tips by heart. But for reading and listening skill, it's not important to sit in your study table and listen or reading exercises and solving reading exercises all the time. Because you can explore them in your daily activities, like you can watch Korean news and listen to Korean songs, and I prefer watching Korean talk shows because you can listen their native accent. And for me, whenever I ride the subways, I go to the subway station and I always read poem that was written on the glass door of the subway station. Of course, I didn't understand completely at first, but I took a picture of it and I then find the meaning of it and I understand that. So I feel really productive for myself, and because I believe that it is not necessary to sit in your study table all the time because you can explore your study in your daily activities.
Of course, learning the language through your daily life is very important and also helpful. Now, before we let you go, Dr. Carlson, do you think the Korean language has global competitiveness? Why and what can we do to raise its competitiveness or lead to more opportunities professionally?
Well, I think South Korea has really established itself as a global actor economically and also a cultural powerhouse as well. So I think the importance of the Korean language will parallel the importance of Korea globally, be that politically, economically, culturally. And I think for young people that will open up maybe not the need. I mean, Koreans are very keen on learning the English language, but anyway, the interest in learning Korean language. And then many young people, when I talk about with young people in the UK or in Europe, they really want to go to Seoul. And Seoul is a vibrant, modern city. They want to go and experience that. And of course, possibly want to live there. And then, of course, knowing the Korean language will be a very big asset. So I think it will just come naturally with the importance of Korea globally.
Well, I'm afraid we will have to wrap up our discussion at this point. Thank you so much, Dr. Carlson and Nguyen, for the meaningful discussion on the Korean language and the alphabet Hangul. Hope to speak to you again soon.